Winter 1944, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. A column of American tanks pushes through the mud-slick track, their steel tracks churning the frozen earth. Inside the lead tank, Corporal James Miller squints through the periscope, the glass fogged with his breath. At 1,200 yards, a flash erupts from a tree line. The shell, a high-velocity 75mm round from a German Pak-40, slams into the upper front hull. The crew braces for the familiar catastrophic fireball, but instead hears a deafening clang that vibrates through the entire 42-ton vehicle. The tank rocks but keeps moving. This is not a standard Sherman. This is an M4A3E2, a jumbo with frontal armour of 102mm, enough to turn a lethal shot into a glancing blow. What the German anti-tank crew saw as just another target was a mobile fortress, a deliberate rejection of American tank doctrine that had been written in blood on the Normandy beaches. This was a machine designed not just to fight, but to survive the first, most terrifying seconds of an engagement. This was the Sherman Jumbo, an up-armoured variant of America's most produced medium tank. It carried additional steel plates that could stop anti-tank rounds previously considered lethal to Shermans, and it forced German anti-tank crews to completely rethink their engagement tactics or risk becoming casualties themselves. The problem was brutally simple. By late 1943, American tank crews were facing a crisis of confidence. Standard Sherman M4 tanks with their 76mm frontal armour were being destroyed at alarming rates by a spectrum of German anti-tank weapons. In the hedgerows of Normandy, a single well-placed 88mm shell from a Tiger tank at 1,000 yards could penetrate a Sherman's armour and ignite its ammunition, often killing the entire five-man crew. But it wasn't just the big guns. The Panther tank's long-barreled 75mm gun could punch through a Sherman at 1,500 yards. Worse still were the infantry-held weapons. The Panzerfaust, a one-shot disposable launcher, could destroy a Sherman at 60 metres, and the more potent Panzerschreck, a copy of the American bazooka, was effective out to 150 metres. Field reports from Normandy in June 1944 showed that for every German tank destroyed, 3 American tanks were lost, a ratio that was unsustainable. The psychological impact was devastating. Crews began calling their Shermans Ronsons for their tendency to light up the first time they were hit, or Tommy Cookers. While the wet stowage ammunition racks introduced in later models reduced fire risk by about 60%, the fundamental problem of armour penetration remained. What the Allies needed was not a faster tank or a better gun, but one that could survive the initial hit long enough to fire back. To understand why the Jumbo emerged, you have to understand the constraints. American tank doctrine, shaped by the interwar years and the need for transatlantic logistics, emphasized mobility and production numbers over heavy armour. The Sherman was designed to be shipped overseas in massive quantities and to exploit breakthroughs, not to fight head-to-head with heavier opponents. The Sherman's original Continental radial engine produced only 400 horsepower, barely adequate for the 30-ton standard model. The logic seemed bulletproof on paper. Thicker armour equals better protection, but in practice every pound added would require careful consideration of the tank's power-to-weight ratio and mobility. Adding armour meant reducing speed from 26 miles per hour to a crawl, increasing fuel consumption, and putting unprecedented strain on the mechanical components. The suspension, a vertical volute spring system, was already near its load limit. Engineers also had to contend with the fact that additional armour would make the tank a larger target and potentially more difficult to transport across the Atlantic or across temporary Bailey bridges in combat zones, which were often rated for just 30 tons. The challenge was adding protection without creating a self-propelled bunker that could not keep up with the war. The solution was the Sherman Jumbo, officially designated the M4A3E2. The conversion process began in August 1944 at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Michigan. Engineers started with standard M4A3 Sherman hulls and welded an additional 38mm armour plate to the front, creating a total thickness of 102mm. The turret was completely redesigned. Instead of the standard curved casting, it was a massive, boxy new forging with 150mm frontal armour and 76mm on the sides. To accommodate this additional weight, the tank's final drive ratio was modified, reducing its top speed from 26 to 22 miles per hour. The Jumbo retained the standard 75mm main gun rather than the more powerful 76mm version. as the larger T-23 turret required for the 76mm gun would have added even more weight and created a shot trap where rounds could deflect into the thin hull roof. The result was a tank weighing 42 tons, nearly 20% heavier than the standard Sherman but still using the same 400 horsepower engine. The Jumbo's ground pressure increased to 14.8 pounds per square inch, making it more prone to bogging down in the soft, muddy terrain of northern Europe. Production numbers were limited. Only 254 Jumbos were manufactured between August and December 1944, making them relatively rare but highly valued by the crews who received them. Each one cost approximately $67,000, about $10,000 more than a standard M4A3. The Jumbo emerged from a specific institutional context, the US Army Ordnance Department's response to urgent field requests from armoured units in Europe. General George S. Patton's Third Army had been particularly vocal about the need for better armoured Shermans after the Normandy campaign. The Ordnance Department, led by Major General Gladian M. Barnes, faced a difficult choice: wait for the development of entirely new tank designs like the M26 Pershing, which were mired in bureaucratic and technical delays, or modify existing Shermans to address immediate needs. They chose the latter, recognizing that time was as valuable a resource as steel. The Fisher Body Division of General Motors, already producing standard Shermans, was tasked with implementing the modifications. Their engineers worked around the clock to develop the up-armour kits that could be applied to existing production lines with minimal disruption. The decision to prioritize armour over firepower reflected a fundamental shift in American armoured doctrine, acknowledging that crew survival was becoming as important as tank versus tank combat performance. The Jumbo was not meant to be a tank destroyer. It was designed to be a mobile pillbox that could lead assaults, absorb punishment, and protect its crew long enough to accomplish its mission. It was a pragmatic compromise, a weapon born of necessity rather than visionary design. Now, before we get into what replaced it, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the engineering of warfare. Right back to the Jumbo on the front lines. The Jumbo's baptism by fire came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. In the frozen Ardennes forest, American units found themselves facing German Panther and Tiger tanks in terrain that negated the Sherman's traditional advantages of mobility and numbers. One Jumbo from the 3rd Armoured Division, commanded by Sergeant Robert D. Brown, took multiple direct hits from a German Panther's 75mm gun at 600 yards. While standard Shermans would have been destroyed by the first or second shot, Brown's Jumbo sustained 7 hits before its gunner managed to knock out the Panther with a well-placed round into its weaker side armour. After-action reports noted that while the Jumbo's armour had been penetrated in 2 places, the crew remained unharmed and the tank was able to withdraw under its own power. In another engagement near St. Vith, a single Jumbo held off a German assault for 45 minutes, absorbing 9 anti-tank rounds before its main gun was disabled. The tank's crew survived and later reported that the psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. They visibly hesitated when they realized their weapons were ineffective against the Jumbo's frontal armour. A captured German Panzer grenadier later recounted, "We were told to aim for the tracks or the machine gun port. The front plate was a waste of our precious shells." These field experiences confirmed what the engineers had hoped. The Jumbo could survive encounters that would destroy standard Shermans, giving American tankers a fighting chance against Germany's armoured forces. And that is where it gets complicated. The Jumbo was not a miracle weapon. It was a system of trade-offs that solved some problems while creating others. The additional armour, while effective against direct frontal hits, did little to protect the tank's sides, rear or vulnerable hull bottom from mines. The extra weight strained the Sherman's mechanical systems, leading to increased breakdown rates. Jumbos required 30% more maintenance than standard models, with transmission failures being particularly common. The reduced speed and manoeuvrability made them less effective in exploitation roles, and they were often left behind when faster armoured units broke through enemy lines. Crews also reported that the cramped interior became even more confining with the additional armour, making it harder to operate the tank effectively for extended periods. The thick turret casting created a dangerous shot trap at its base, where a shell striking the lower front slope could be deflected downward into the thin hull roof. Perhaps most significantly, the Jumbo's 75mm gun was inadequate for penetrating the frontal armour of late-war German tanks like the Tiger II, which had 180mm of frontal armour. This meant that while the Jumbo could survive an initial engagement, it still needed to manoeuvre to fire at the weaker side or rear armour of German heavy tanks, a task made more difficult by its reduced mobility and the terrifying presence of German infantry with Panzerfaust waiting in ambush. The Jumbo didn't win the war alone. It filled a critical gap in Allied armoured capabilities during a period when German anti-tank technology had temporarily outpaced American tank design. In combined arms operations, Jumbos typically led assaults, drawing fire and absorbing the first hits while standard Shermans manoeuvred to flank enemy positions. This tactical arrangement allowed American units to maintain offensive momentum despite the technical superiority of some German armoured vehicles. The psychological effect on German anti-tank crews was significant. Knowing that some American tanks could withstand their best weapons forced them to adjust their tactics, often waiting for closer shots or targeting the more vulnerable side and rear armour. This hesitation gave American tankers precious seconds to identify and eliminate threats. The Jumbo also demonstrated the importance of adaptability in warfare, rather than waiting for entirely new tank designs to be developed and shipped to Europe. American engineers found a way to modify existing vehicles to meet immediate battlefield needs. This pragmatic approach reflected the broader industrial and logistical advantages that ultimately gave the Allies the edge in the war of production. While Germany was perfecting complex, difficult-to-produce tanks like the King Tiger, the United States was refining and improving its existing reliable workhorse. By the spring of 1945, the Jumbo's moment had largely passed. With the introduction of the M26 Pershing heavy tank with its 90mm gun and improved armour, the Jumbo became an interim solution that had served its purpose. Most surviving Jumbos were either converted back to standard configurations or scrapped after the war. Today, only a handful remain in museums at Fort Benning, the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armour, and the Bovington Tank Museum in England. The Jumbo's legacy lives on in modern tank design philosophy, which continues to balance the competing demands of armour, firepower, and mobility. The concept of up-armouring a proven chassis for specific roles, seen in vehicles like the M1A2 Abrams Tusk variant, is a direct descendant of the Jumbo's pragmatic logic. The lesson of the Jumbo is clear. In wartime, perfect solutions are rare, but practical adaptations can make the difference between victory and defeat. The Jumbo was not the best tank of World War II, nor was it the most powerful. But for a brief, critical period, it was exactly what American tankers needed. A rolling shield that could take the hits and keep fighting. Obsolete is a word for peacetime. In combat, there is only what works and what does not.